Right, how's everybody doing tonight? Good? Excellent. All right, so for those that are in the course, you have all your assignments and everything should be all systems go. I've had some good requests for feedback on your final project, so hopefully they're all got all the clarifications you need. I'm just going to reply to the ones that I haven't tonight. So that's all good. So tonight, it's going to be the last podcast for this class, but I'm going to probably take a break for a bit. But these will continue. So I'm going to send out a link to put you on the distribution list for generally. So if you want to continue to attend them whenever in the future, then you're welcome to do so. You don't have to be in a class necessarily. So there we go. And tonight, what I wanted to talk about is this topic of release and reinvention. I talked about it last week, but I alluded to it 2 weeks ago when I was, it just kind of came to me when I was at UBC and was thinking about it. And I guess why I think this is an important topic to close with as well, and particularly right now, is that the situation that we often find ourselves in and that we're finding ourselves in collectively right now as a society is not uncommon. This idea of a breakdown. It seems like there's a breakdown going on, or at least fundamental change. Some people, you've heard this in the news, a restart or a reset, the Great Reset. Have you heard of this before? The Great Reset? So there's a conspiracy theory going around actually about this Great Reset, which is a kind of a government control, top-down type of thing, which is interesting, but really ultimately what it's referring to, I think, is the fact that it's called COVID, yeah. But this whole idea of resetting, I wanted to look at tonight, because it's not uncommon in nature. Lots of your Nelson friends are posting about the Great Reset. Seriously? It doesn't surprise me. Because those would be the hippie conspiracy theory folks. Those are the good ones. I like those ones. Those ones I'm okay with, I can hang out with. It's the other ones that have AR-15s. Throw 5G in there too. It's the ones that have AR-15 automatic rifles that I'm concerned about, because when they get freaked out, then bullets start flying. So what I want to talk about, I'm born in Nelson, so I've got a special place in my heart for all those folks. But what I wanted to talk about is this idea of release, reinvention, and how to kind of conceptualize it, and not how, not being prescriptive about it, but recognizing that it's an actual thing, and that it's a known thing in science and ecosystems and social systems, but also it's an understood thing in age-old societies. And then it's also a thing that we experience personally, like I'm sure all of you have at certain points in your life thus far had times where you think like the world was going to come down on you, or really rough times, right? And those are those are the times where you think things just are never going to get better, but they do get better, right? And hopefully, and usually they do, or at least better than they were at the catastrophic time. And you realize that this is something that's somewhat cyclical, and it happens. And therefore, cyclical processes are things that we can kind of get our head around. So that's what I wanted to talk about, is this whole idea of release and reinvention, but going from the mythological to the scientific. And in fact, I'm going to go from the scientific to the mythological in the order of how I want to tackle this, and then we can talk about some examples. So why is it important? Well, maybe it's not, actually. Maybe this is just mythology, but it's important for people that work in this field, and I'm going to tell you why. Uh, because a big part of our job, and you as kind of students or burgeoning practitioners, is the fact that you're going to have to become a lot better at understanding the dynamics of systems. More so, actually, because I think more so than before. Like when I was first graduating from Rhodes 20 years ago, even then systems thinking was kind of new, I guess, newish. Um, but even still, if you're like kind of just looking at specific things, that was fine. Whereas now, I think regardless of what you're doing in the environmental field, you need to kind of have a really good handle on how these systems dynamics works. Partially because I think climate change is it's a non-linear and multi-dimensional threat or impact. So you kind of have to look at things in those different ways, and that's going to be something that you're going to have to deal with going forward for sure. So it's something that's important, and it's important for our job to understand the interactions of society with the environment and some of the complex interactions that this entails. Now, we've talked about the idea of resilience, right? We've been through the resilience concept, you've read about it, and you have an idea of what that is. Um, and it's a model to understand conceptually and then also to apply, whether you're working for a company or an NGO or government or what have you. However, the point is, one of the kind of principles behind the resilience theory is the fact that there's multiple stable states or zones of stability and instability in systems. But the question is, what happens when something goes beyond the threshold of stability and there's a collapse? And what about collapse? Like how can we expect things to recover after there is a collapse? And often cases there is no easy solution, right? It's often very unique to the situation. I mean, like the pandemic, for instance, is something that, these are waters that not many of us have been through before. I haven't, certainly. So it's useful to look at, to have models to look to as a frame of reference. It's also useful to look to see how different societies have framed this process. So the process of collapse and renewal, and so we can have some comfort that it's happened before and that people have made it through, and that maybe there's some meaning to everything, right? There's some kind of, we can learn something from the process, all right? So that's really like, why is it an important thing? So first, what is a model? Now, I mean, there are a bunch of different models for this stuff, depending on what kind of way you want to look at the problem and what dimension, if it's like a personal perspective or if it's, historical or what have you. I'm just going to show you one model, which is closely related to things that we've been working on, which is the panarchy model. Now, I've mentioned this before, but we'll go through it in a little more detail. So here's a link. That link there, if you go to it, is will take you to a group called the Resilience Alliance, which is a kind of an ad hoc group of people that do research in this area out of Stockholm and then other places. And this definition page gives you an overview of what this model is. So if you go to that page, you'll see what it's about. So I'm just going to pull that up myself. Sec. So if you could look at that, now it's what this model is and how it came into being. It kind of evolved from resilience originally. As you will note, you'll see that two of the authors on some of the main papers behind this are, one is Buzz Halling, who was the guy who wrote the initial paper on ecological resilience in 1973. So it's a multi-scale model that deals with social and ecological interactions. And what it shows is there's, this is not like a single, often anyway, when you look at a system like a forest or like a, whatever, a marine ecosystem, or marine social and ecological system, there's multiple different cycles going on at the same time. So the way they frame this, and you can see this in this diagram here, is that you have smaller and faster kind of adaptive cycles. Those are adaptive cycles going on, okay? So there's an interacting set of hierarchical structured scales, and this interacting set of hierarchies in adaptive cycles is the panarchy model. And there's, to get into more detail behind it, there is a good book, but there's also an article. So I'll put this through, and I can include this in a follow-up email as well. Here. This is the article, Buzz Halling, Understanding the Complexity of Economic, Ecological, and Social Systems. And then there's a book that was written, this is the link to the book, Panarchy, Understanding Transformations in Human and Natural Systems. And both are good. I mean, the paper is a little more academic, but I mean, worth a look. So this model originally derived its name from the Greek god of nature, whose name was Pan, and the whole kind of meaning for any, but you know, as you know, likely from mythology, especially Greek and Roman mythology, all of these kind of characters and mythical characters had some sort of like meaning to them, right? Mercury, Athena, Apollo, etc., the god of war, and this, that, and the other thing. So Pan is the god of nature, and this kind of the character that that he is embodying is that of unpredictable change. So, and this model is really about that. It's about rationalizing the difference between change and persistence, like whether something stays the same or whether it's going to shift, or whether something is predictable or unpredictable, whether we know something is going to happen or whether there's a high degree of uncertainty with what's going to happen next. So that model of nested adaptive cycles are across spatial scales, size scales even. So what does the omega symbol mean at the bottom? We'll get into that. Actually, I don't know if it will during this, but I will send clarification with the follow-up on this. I just got a lot to cover in this. So where was I here? So there are nested adaptive cycles. So there's sub-cycles that tend to be smaller, okay? More dynamic. And the smaller they are, the faster they are, right? So if you look at that in that image there, you'll see that you've got these smaller ones, small and fast, down at the bottom of the hierarchy. And then you have these larger ones at the top, right? So the way this kind of conceptually works, and keep in mind, these are often, especially in this manner, it's a conceptual model. Unlike if you've done any physics, force equals mass times Newton's laws, right? Or you know, any kind of differential equations or statics, dynamics, any kind of physics. It's a little more kind of, it's not a heuristic model in those cases. Those are mathematical models or scientific models that functionally work in a certain way, like population dynamics models as well in biology. And this is a little different because it's slightly more on the heuristic side, because you're dealing with, you know, the interaction between social and ecological systems. So it's not like necessarily this cause and effect type of model. This is more of a heuristic representation to some degree. So we have these small and fast cycles at the bottom, and then we have these kind of emergent cycles at the top. And these are connected, right? So as you can see, you see these arrows between them. So these subcycles are more rapid, more dynamic, and those are like invention, experimenting, and testing. So they're more prone to kind of failure, fast dynamic changes, and so forth. And then the larger ones set the conditions for the smaller adaptive cycles, right? They're like the overall kind of mothership, if you will. Now I want to give you an example. So this sounds perhaps abstract, so I want to give you a concrete example so you can try and visualize this. So for example, if we're looking at a forest, there are adaptive cycles that are occurring at a fairly large scale. So what might you think those large scale adaptive cycles might be in a forest? We're going through one right now over the past couple months, 3 months. If you're, could be, yeah, that could be one major, it's a major change, right? So a forest fire could be a major change, even seasonal change, right? So all the leaves falling from the trees, right? This is a macro, there we go, that's what I'm getting at, is autumn, seasonal change from summer to autumn to winter. Yeah, that's associated with it, that you could, if you're looking at that piece. I'm looking at this like a big system change. So fall is a big system change, right? Because one of the on a larger scale, in a forest, you have leaf cover and canopy structure that basically sets the temperature and micrometeorological conditions for all of the species in the forest, right? So imagine if you're, insects, like if you're looking at insects or an ant colony or whatever it is, termites on the forest floor, that larger adaptive cycle that will set like a major condition for your subsystem would be one of those larger kind of larger slower cycles, right? And that will control how much radiation comes in and how much water comes in and some of this bigger larger scale conditions. Whereas at the bottom ones, so as you go down in scale, at smaller scales, you'll see more more dynamics happening. So like, for instance, insect colonies and all these kind of things that are happening at a much finer scale, even photosynthesis for that matter, one could say is a smaller scale process. So you can have potentially multiple connections between scales. So, and you have this connection where you have revolt, which is these aggregated, these multiple smaller scale rapid dynamic processes happening at a smaller scale in a forest that when aggregated may influence or impact kind of the larger scale, slower processes, right? Do you have an idea? You see where I'm going with this? This kind of connection between scales. And then you have these large seasonal changes, in this case in a forest, which don't happen quickly. It's not like tomorrow there's no leaves. It takes time. It's a series, and in our case, it's about a couple months that this is happening, but it will affect these overall macro conditions of that system. So if you wanted to start to model that and draw this out, you could really pick out certain large scale processes of that ecosystem or social and ecological system, and then pick out the smaller things that are going on within it, okay? So back to Nelson. Nelson's a perfect place to do something like this because you get very discrete seasons. And so you could look at the behavior of subsystems within Nelson. I don't know, it could be even commercial activity and all this kind of stuff that goes on, how people respond to seasonality, whereas you have this large scale seasonal change that occurs there. Even you look at that in recreational sports, right? So this is like a model of how these things can be connected and kind of articulated. So you can have multiple different smaller dynamics connecting to a larger scale one. But what we don't see in this in that kind of overall framework, when you have like this large system, large cycle, adaptive cycle, and then smaller adaptive cycles, is you don't see the complexity in each one of those cycles. So in each one of those cycles that's going on, you see that you have a cycle of birth, growth, maturation, death, and renewal. And it's constantly going. Now it's constantly going at different time scales, right? And different spatial scales, but that is what is going on. So going back to the example of the forest, this is an annual process, right? A forest goes through these annual transitions based on meteorological conditions. When it gets colder and less sunlight and changes in temperature, you get leaves fall and so forth. And then in addition, at the smaller scales, we see other dynamics, right? So if we're going back to that example of seeing insect colonies or something, there's going to be other things that are going on there in that smaller adaptive cycle. It could be food availability, what have you. So the adaptive cycle explicitly introduced mutations and rearrangements as a periodic process within each hierarchical level in a way that partially isolates the resulting experiments, reducing the risk to the integrity of the whole structure. So you have a lot of things going on within this overall kind of forest, for example, that are at the smaller scale, rapid dynamic experiments, if you will, that sometimes have bigger influence and sometimes they just, they just fail. And so these are the phases. Then we have exploitation, conservation, release, reorganization in each individual cycle. So what does this mean then? How might this be useful for you then? This would be useful, and I would encourage you to kind of spend a bit more time with this as you progress with dealing with some of the problems that we face in this kind of work, to be able to look at a situation, whether it be your company or whether it be a project or whether it be back in Nelson in your community, and say, okay, well, what's going on here? I see a problem going on, some sort of, can be a social and ecological problem. Usually that's how we frame this stuff. And then say, how can I, what is the big picture? Like what's the macro trend going on here? Season change, right? That's the macro trend, if this is what we're talking about. And then identify some of the smaller adaptive cycles that are going on within that kind of overall system. So if you wanted to look at commercial activity, for instance, you could look at, well, I mean, you could look at the stores and see what, how they're reacting to this by what they're selling. I remember when I was there as a kid, we'd always have the seasonal ski sale at the start of the ski season. Like a clock, you could go and go to that. And if you go to any of the stores on Baker Street, you can see how they react to this stuff. Same with tourism and so forth and so on. So the key here is to look at how can you frame it and how can you literally draw it. That's what I would encourage you to try and do. Say, look, okay, I see something big is going on here. I want to draw that and put variables to it, like time frames and so forth. And then see what are some of the smaller adaptive cycles that are contributing to that, while recognizing that each one of those adaptive cycles is going through this process of transformation, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but you have to determine that. You have to go and look at it and say, okay, well, what's going on here? Like in some cases, the life cycle of certain species and communities of species is very short, right? Daphnia and different kind of microorganisms. So an exercise would be to look at a system and try and kind of figure out how that's working. Okay, another example that I will encourage you to think about or look at, because I think it's like a forest. It's one we're mostly familiar with, and also one that you can practice on, is lake ecosystems, right? We had talked, I believe, before about eutrophication, and there's actually been a lot of really good work done on eutrophication and resilience and social and ecological systems coupling. So it's a great example of scale interactions and this process of exploitation, conservation, release, and reorganization. Because these lake ecosystems go through processes of change. When we talk about eutrophication, we're talking about a fundamental change in the nutrient balance in a lake. It's getting loaded with phosphorus and nitrogen up to a point at which it gets eutrophied, right? So meaning that it gets covered with algae or plankton or lake biota because of just the sheer amount of nutrients in the water, which then has other effects by reducing the biological oxygen demand of the lake and so forth and so on, and then ultimately killing. So like Salt Spring Island, St. Mary's Lake. Could be, I don't know that one. But yeah, I mean, we see it all over the place. There's a lot of good examples of it. So that's one that that you can practice on if you want, because it's kind of, what those variables are, and you can see the big process, and then some of the smaller scale processes are kind of well established. You understand what they are. So there's a good paper that I'll share with you here, at least the name of it, that you can use as an example to take a look at that. And it's Steve Carpenter and Lathrop. Steve Carpenter is a resilience person, and he's done a lot of this kind of work, so quantitative assessment of these cycles and processes, because it's a hard thing to experiment with. And in this particular experiment or study, what they've done is looking at trying to estimate thresholds for eutrophication, right? So when we talk about this whole, the whole adaptive cycle, you're assuming you get to the point at which it collapses, meaning you get to a point where it eutrophies. And then after that, it's like, okay, well, here we go. Then it has to reorganize and, rebuild. However, you don't necessarily want to get to that point, right? You don't, especially if it's a critical water supply. But what Carpenter has done a series of experiments on lakes, controlled experiments, to look at how do you measure where these threshold points are. And so this paper that I'm pointing to you right here is a good example of, of how they've gone about doing that. And not often do you get that chance. So that's kind of this attempt at a quantitative way of looking at this, which I think is practically useful for you as well, especially going forward in your career. But there's also this soft side of all this stuff, right? Like the change in families. I've recently lost a very important person in our family, and it's there's this is happening going on right now. This whole cycle of reorganization and revitalization is literally happening in my family as a result of that. And so it's interesting to look at this and try and see if you can better understand these situations given these kind of bodies of knowledge. So, but another really interesting way to look at this is to look at social collapse, right? How societies have collapsed before. So there's a book, now full disclosure, I haven't read this book. I've heard all of my colleagues have, but it's on my list. I'm gonna get it. But this is one to look at because a lot of people have given this a lot, either praise or criticism. Usually it's one of the two. All the geography people I know, because I'm a geographer, criticize this because pop geography, but for what I understand, I know other books that he has written and read other books. Guns, Germs, and Steel is one. But this is an interesting one. I would recommend taking a look at it from what I've heard. And the reason why I bring it up in the context of this discussion is that what he does in that, and he is a geographer, what he's done is look at analyzing societies that have collapsed. So what are some societies that have collapsed that we know of? Rome is one. What another? Aztecs, yep. Other ones? Mayans, I think, have collapsed. Well, they did at one point too. Mongols, Vikings, gosh, Incas. Yeah, there's a number. There's a lot. I mean, the big ones everybody usually picks out are the Romans and the Aztecs and maybe the Mayans. Guns, Germs, and Steel. Yeah, that's his other book. So you might want to take a look at that one. I think I've read the whole thing on that one. I think that one's more about colonialization. But this book that I'm referring to here, Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, is interesting because what he does, and from what I understand a pretty good job of it, is look at these different situations and try and dissect what were the things that caused them to collapse, and why I think would be worth looking at. Like, I mean, that's going to be on my list of Christmas reading, finally. He's actually written another one. Has he written that 1416? He wrote another one on colonialization, so not Guns, Germs, and Steel, 1416, The Discovery of South America. That's a good one. But the collapse one, it would be interesting to look at it from after having taken this course and thinking about sustainable development, because a lot of those stories of collapse are in some way, shape, or form tied to natural resources. Well, yeah, you could say that. You could say America perhaps is in that situation right now. It's hard to say, but I won't go quick to say that because America and Canada are tied at the hip. So I hope we're not going in that direction because we're next door, right? What happens in America happens here, they say, right? So that would be a good reference to look at. But I mean, the first thing I hope that you're able to get out of this tonight, and hopefully even the course, is to try and kind of draw stuff and model it and think about it. So even if you're doing a sustainability plan for a company, you can say, look, well, what's going on? What are the major trends going on that we're involved with right now as an organization? And given your background, this gives you, you can do that. You can do the framework, but you can also fill it in. That's your superpower. Like, your superpower is the fact that you actually know what you're talking about. You know, you have, hopefully, I've learned some stuff at Royal Roads, and have like concrete knowledge and skills that you can draw on to like articulate certain parts of the environmental problem, right? In our course 322, it's more about like this, putting it all together in an articulate and understanding the history of these ideas. So that's one macro view of things, but I want to spend the rest of the time, short time that we have, talking about the micro view of things, which is again something that I've had to deal with as of late, but also something that I've always been quite fascinated with, actually, and that is this whole idea of personal death, renewal, or personal tragedy, death, and renewal, which ties into individual resilience. I'm not fascinated by death. I'm fascinated by how we deal with adversity. And one of the most staring examples is, you know, dealing with death, right? Or dealing with being confronted with death. So I want to use the example of a group called the Anishinaabe First Nations group in Canada, on their perspective on life or death. I know it's a terrible thing. It's awful to talk about, but I mean, it is part of life, man. Like, part of life is death. But I think it's really interesting to kind of put this in perspective. And I really think we can learn a lot from First Nations. And I'll tell you why. And hopefully you'll agree with me after I give you this Cole's notes of the Ojibwe, or the Anishinaabe perspective of life and death, because we are on this short-term continuum, typically in North American Western society, that is often very short-sighted. Whereas when you have societies that are, you know, thousands of years old and still kicking strong, you might want to listen to some of the things that they believe, because they probably make some sense. So here is a full PDF. And again, as you know, these will be included in the notes that can be downloaded from the YouTube comments section or description. So if we look at that, you don't necessarily need to look at that, but it's all there. The Anishinaabe have perspective on life and death is that they operate they view things as a circle of life. And it's said that in order to understand death, one first must embrace the circle of life. And they see there's 4 stages in the journey of the human spirit: birth, life, death, and the afterlife. And there is various types of creation stories, and these creation stories kind of tie into this legacy of relationships with our ancestors from the beginning of time to the present, which again I find very interesting, because, you know, when we think of our ancestors, at least me and most people I know, think of 1 or 2 generations of relatives, right? My great-grandfather comes from here. And we don't go much further back than that. Like, I don't really track my ancestry back further before even my grandparents too much. You know, I don't go back to, okay, well, in 2000 BC, my relative was, you know, here. Whereas the Anishinaabe legitimately can go back that far. And so therefore these creation stories are means of establishing that legacy from the beginning of time to the present. And their feeling is, or their belief is, that each of us is born with a spirit, a sacred name, within a clan or a nation. And each of us has a gift or a talent, and we have a destiny in which we will face many challenges. So through your life, you are coming into being as a human, realized manifestation of a spirit with that kind of a purpose, really, and a spirit. And they have, through in life, we have three great parts, or they say there is great, there in the spirit life having a human experience, or we say in life, they're a spirit having a human experience composed of three parts: spirit, mind, and body. So given we are born a spirit, and it leaves the creator from the spirit world and manifests itself in four stages of life. So there's childhood, youth, adulthood, and elder years. And each person's challenge is to find the creator and celebrate the creator and be of service with one's gift to one's people, to all of humankind, and to all of life and creation. So in doing so, we will be challenged, experience failures, which I'm sure you all have, as have I, confront our weaknesses, embrace healing and spiritual training through various activities through the community. And this spiritual training imprints the identity of the person through adulthood and elder years. So really, your first childhood and youth years are formation into the point at which when you enter adulthood, you're fully formed. And so there's, within the practice of the community, various types of ceremonies that are celebratory in terms of the path through this life. And in dying, um, the spiritual leader or medicine person will call for the will close to the dying person will conduct ceremonies. There's ceremonies through death where your family and your members of your clan will be present. And in this case, this medicine person is not necessarily a person that is going to be giving you, like a doctor in our terms, but more of a spiritual conduit or advisor, if you will, and providing spiritual guidance as you're going through this process. There are special circumstances, as I understand it, for people who are, say, chiefs or people that are, held in higher positions in the clans, like state funerals, for instance, for our politicians and so forth. And then also for people who die unexpectedly, you don't have that process of death. So the process of death, from what I understand in the Anishinaabe culture, is not a final thing. It's simply a transition from one stage of being for your spirit to the next stage of being for a spirit. And at the time of death, the original mother, who they see as Mother Earth, reclaims the physical form of our body. And our original father, the creator, takes their spirits to return to them, to their place of origin. And then in the afterlife, so as I said, it's a transition from the living manifestation of who we are and what we do and our agency and how we act in our life to this next stage for our spirit. And in the afterlife, the spirit can be seen and felt leaving the body, which is so interesting. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced that. Has anybody ever experienced someone dying in front of you? Yes. Anybody else? Only animals. Well, it's still interesting though. Like I still think it's a parallel. A ski patroller. Holy cow. Whoa, that'd be intense. So, I mean, it gets morbid, but let's kind of like stick to the point here, which is not about death. It's about transformation. Now, I recently experienced this, as I said, and it was one of the weirdest experiences I think I've had, because I felt it. Like I knew when life was no longer there. It was alive, 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 no longer there. There was this point at which that it was almost instantaneous where I felt the spirit left the body of someone who, was very close to me. So it was, equally intense, right? Uh, so I believe this. Like this, I think has a lot of legitimacy. And even within, like Nicolesis mentioned, in an animal, like you've seen that, you see that. I know hunters have talked a lot. I haven't hunted a lot, nor have I fished a lot, but I know hunters talk about this, where they see the life force exiting the whatever they have killed, whatever they've seen. They get it with a shot or whatever, and it's still alive, and they go up and they can feel the animal still alive. But there's a point when the life leaves that animal that it's just gone, and it's gone. And it's not just about, okay, the heart stopped, they're dead. The energy, like the spirit has left whatever it was, human being, animal, whatever. Was that which animates? Exact. So did you see that with the animals? Did you see this kind of like void? It's like with Leopold in his Kill of the Wolf, he said the green fire in its eyes die out. Okay. Oh, Aldo Leopold, or which Leopold? Oh, okay. I didn't know that one. So this whole idea then of moving into these afterlife, and goes back to the Anishinaabe, the spirit can be seen and felt leaving the body, which frankly, I believe. I've seen it, and I felt that. Travels, in this case, westward across the prairie grass, because the Anishinaabe are in Ontario, Manitoba, or around that area. Um, Ascends the mountains to the high clouds, where a bright light guides it to the place where loved ones wait to embrace it. The spirit lives forever, and it takes its place in the spirit world according to deeds completed on the earth. Hence, this whole idea of karma as well. The cycle of life is complete when the spirit returns to its place of origin. And then within the spirit world, there are, according to the Anishinaabe, 4 levels where the helpers of the Creator work each day and night to teach, heal, guide, and help us plan our ceremonial lives. The first level, closest to Mother Earth, contains spirit helpers who bring us dreams to teach, warn us of future events. The second level, spirit helpers who teach us and appear in ceremonies, seen in visions. Third level, spirit helpers who act as consultants in planning healing ceremonies, warn of possible sources of trouble. And fourth, spirit helpers are healers who enter the lodge and body and bring messages on how to go about healing, give an understanding of the medicines needed. So this, and then there's some other specifics to the Anishinaabe, such as preparing to die and certain ceremonies like the pipe ceremonies and so forth, and the sacred fire. But what I wanted to get at there is this idea of transformation, and the fact that there is a cycle going on, and a cycle that is very much similar to what we experience on a day-to-day basis. So this is my attempt to kind of pull this all together at the end. So if you want to go back to this adaptive cycle model and us as individuals, we are constantly going through this process of ascension or reorganization, building up and plateauing, and then inevitably, at least from my experience also, there's points at which we not collapse, but reorganize and go through that backward loop of the adaptive cycle. And it's a completely normal and natural process. And in fact, one that I think is we learn from, and we develop from, and we gain character from. And all of the rough things in my life, for sure, and there's been some rough things, have been ultimately sources of grit, of great learning and great knowledge. And I wouldn't trade those for anything, because those are the things that have kind of are most memorable to me. Actually, the greatest pain and the greatest troubles and the greatest challenges have been the source of the greatest learning. But really, that I could map those out over time as a series of smaller adaptive cycles that have contributed to, you know, uh, me and my life. And also to, you know, if I look at it in professional terms, taking a company from nothing, an idea, through to, you know, working with parliaments and doing all this kind of other stuff that we happen to do now, is a product of a number of different adaptive cycles. And I could tell you stories that would, you know, you'd freak out over, in terms of just getting through things, but learning as you go. And that is a very important process to go through, and to go through as much as you possibly can, with like just with pleasure if you can. I know it's difficult at the time, but knowing that that all leads, if you do it in the right way, with perseverance and get through it, to a greater level of knowledge and understanding and preparation for big things to come. And, you know, and this is me speaking as someone who's, you know, been at Row Roads 20 years ago. I remember when I finished there, and you know, my eyes were wide, and they should be, because that's, and they still are, just in a different way, as to like what's possible out there in the world. And it is, with kind of what you get from your education there, it will prepare you for tremendous things. However, there are going to be setbacks along the way, and those will just be, though, those small adaptive cycles that will build up to, and build and build and build and build, and make you stronger. And you'll realize that over time, fast forward 20 years, you will look back and say, oh my gosh, look at all those small things and that I had to deal with, but they've all really aggregated it to me being in this position I'm in today. So there we go. And then at a broader philosophical level, I think it's important now for us to consider some of the belief systems like the Anishinaabe and the many other groups out there. I've just chosen the Anishinaabe to walk through as an example, that this whole like experiences of us living on this earth is pretty short in compared to this this massive spirit experience or longer term view, especially if we look at the history of Earth and humans on Earth. So make the most of it. You know, like it's a crappy time for sure, in terms of our limitations on what we can do. But there's always things you can do within that, and with that vision and that view of it, this being just one blip in a much longer kind of trajectory of time, that you can maybe put things in perspective, and work accordingly. So there we go. I think, I mean, there are some people out there that I think could probably benefit from the Anishinaabe story more than others. Perhaps one president south of the border might be someone who should read the Anishinaabe life cycle. They might act differently. I'm not going to mention any names, but yeah. So that's what I have to say for tonight. Any questions? So for those in the class going forward, I mean, we are, you know, at the end of the course now, and we will be wrapping up the course. If you have any questions with the assignment, then just email me, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. I've already had a number of different emails and given clarification. If you have any difficulty with time frames, just let me know. I'm quite flexible, as most people know. My main constraint is when I need to get everything done for the university. They give me a date where everything needs to be done, and that they're not really flexible on that. So as long as I work with that, like as long as whatever circumstance you find yourself in, I can make work with that, then you know, then we're good. But I need to know. That's the key thing. Is just email me. The book by Sweetgrass. Okay, I highly recommend the book Braiding Sweetgrass by. Awesome. I will check that out. I'm gonna make a note of that. There's also, as we're talking about references, John Burroughs. If you're interested in law and kind of First Nations perspectives on law, there's a guy named John Burroughs who's quite famous in general, but particularly in Canada, in First Nations legal Indigenous law, and he's an Anishinaabe, and I've read some of his stuff. It's really interesting. He kind of looks at things from quite a different perspective. I mean, some of the more traditional lawyers will, poo-poo that stuff, but if you're at all interested in that, guy name is, I'll write it, John Burroughs. I just learned of his stuff a couple years ago, but I really liked reading it. Okay. There's Canadian's Indigenous Constitution. There's a book by John Burroughs. I always say John Burroughs. Yes. Yeah, check his stuff out. Like go to the library and grab some of his articles, or just check him out in journals. He's written a lot of journal articles as well, at least some that I've read anyway. Interesting guy. And if you Google on YouTube, you'll see some of videos with him presenting things. It's really neat. Interesting perspectives on things. Another great one is, I think I may have mentioned Gregory Kahete. I don't know if I have or not, but he's an American. Yeah. He's Navajo, I believe. Fantastic, super interesting stuff he's written. I'd check it out. Kahete is awesome. Menzies out at UBC has written some great stuff. Atleo has written some good stuff. Ignaces at the SFU have written some great stuff. It's a lot of really a growing body of really interesting literature in that area. All right. Well, our time is up for the night. Thank you for coming out, and thank you for those that are in the course, all the work you put in. I look forward to taking a look at your final assignments. I will send out a link to get on the distribution list for the podcast in general, so it won't go through your RRU emails. So that will be then obviously voluntary. You don't have to sign up to that, but if you want to, then sign up and you will be on the list that will get kind of a queue every time it's going on. Or if there's things that come up, new research or things that relate to what I'm working on, then that may be updated through that list as well. But again, it's all voluntary. All right, I'm going to sign out. Are you doing podcasts for the? Yes, Linda, I will. So what I'll probably do is, considering it's going to be over the Christmas break, I'll start with, I'll do a couple to start off. Yeah, I'll do that. I made a note. Lisa. Panarchy. I'll include that in the notes. What I'll do, Linda, is I will do a couple, maybe like, it starts on the 30th, so the first couple weeks, and then we're going to take a break. I want to break from this for a good 3 to 4 weeks, and then we'll hit it again in January. So there'll be a good dose of them, and it will give me some time to just think about new stuff and come up with some new stuff. So